From the Oklahoman newsroom, this is an OSU update. I'm Jenny Carlson here with Kyle Fredrickson. Kyle, two openings ended up being on the Oklahoma State coaching staff. Both were filled relatively quickly, one by a very familiar name, another that is familiar to a lot of insiders at OSU. Let's start with Josh Henson, who takes over the offensive line position. Seems like he'll probably transition pretty easily for the Cowboys.
Yeah, you know, if anyone can appreciate a former OSU player coming back to coach for the Cowboys, it's Mike Gundy, obviously, who played Cowboy quarterback for OSU back in the 1980s. Josh Henson played offensive line for the Cowboys in the late 1990s, was a GA in Stillwater in 99, eventually got promoted into a recruiting coordinator and tight end coaching role, and has really blossomed that into a pretty impressive career before coming back to Stillwater. His time as an offensive coordinator at Missouri cut short when they made a coaching change. Henson was able to come back as an offensive analyst last season, and that's what makes this hire so interesting. You know, here's a guy who knows the personnel, was watching film of this group throughout the season, wasn't able to coach them on the field in his analyst role, but that getting to know you period really gets cut short with his hire, and I think that's big for the Cowboys as they return 4 of the 5 starters up front. They get a guy who would appear to want to be in Stillwater, especially since Henson hired to go to Arizona State just a few days before accepting this position to come back to OSU in this offensive line role. So I think when we're looking at all the turnover that we've seen in this spot, you know, Henson is the 4th offensive line coach in 5 years for the Cowboys. To have a guy who wants to be there, who knows the personnel, really a perfect situation.
Yeah, obviously a guy that, you know, people that follow OSU football know about Josh Henson. Now, John Wozniak, who's taking over the running back coach position, maybe not as known widely, but he has OSU ties as well.
Absolutely. 2004, Wozniak was a GA with the Cowboys on the same staff with Mike Gundy as the offensive coordinator, Todd Monken as the receivers coach. So a lot of OSU ties that ended up being pretty, you know, perennial figures for the program going down the line after that 2004 season. But, you know, Wozniak's a guy who was really a bit of a journeyman in his career after OSU, was on national title winning staffs, not as an assistant coach, but as an analyst at both LSU under Les Miles and Nick Saban at Alabama in 2012. So he knows what it takes to build up a perennial championship contender. Spent the past few seasons under Todd Monken at Southern Miss as a position coach for the Golden Eagles. So there is some familiarity there, but, you know, with this Wozniak hire, I think there's very big shoes to fill. You know, filling the role as offensive line coach for Henson would seem a little more seamless, as where Wozniak is going to go into a position where he's got a returning star in Justice Hill, but behind that, there's not a whole lot of depth at the position. The Cowboys brought in 2 players that Marcus Arroyo recruited, who come in very highly rated, but in terms of how he'll adjust and what might happen if Justice Hill, for some reason, suffers an injury during the season, I think there's a lot of pressure on Wozniak to sort of continue building the momentum that this group's already established.
Lastly, as we talk about incoming players, it brings up recruiting, because Carlos Arroyo had really become the star recruiter on this staff, and you lose him to Oregon. Obviously, I assume they're going to send him out on the recruiting trail to try to get guys there to Eugene, so that recruiting role now has to fall to somebody else. Henson, known as a pretty decent recruiter as well. Do they have 2 guys that they think can fill that recruiting role, or do they feel like one of the 2 may sort of fill that star recruiter role?
Well, Henson's history at OSU really helps him, I think, a lot in terms of knowing the landscape of Texas. You know, it's a state that the Cowboys have recruited for years and years under Mike Gundy and Les Miles, so there is some familiarity there. But with John Wozniak, it does make you wonder. Being at Southern Miss, you know, that's a program that recruits a lot locally, doesn't have quite the presence that OSU has in Texas, but does recruit there as well. But you're right, you know, as we look at these guys and sort of the roles they're expected to fill, one of the reasons that Coach Greg Atkins, is no longer on the staff was because of the decommitments late in the process for the Cowboys this last cycle, only signing 1 offensive lineman. And like you mentioned, with the progress that Marcus Arroyo had made in getting some national recruits into Stillwater, those guys are going to be on campus still, but as they move forward and try to build some depth, Wozniak has a lot of big shoes to fill in terms of getting some talent on campus.
All right, we're hoping to be able to meet these guys, get them on camera, get them on the record to talk about these new jobs here at some point down the line. And when we do, we'll have a lot more on Josh Henson and John Wozniak. So be sure to stay with the best coverage team anywhere at newsok.com and every day in the Oklahoman.